Alrighty, hi there everyone, and thanks for such a great opening paper with an interesting case study. Peter and I are going to take it to a bit of a more macro level, so mixing it up a bit. My name's Kate Farhall. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. So representing the team from the other side of the world and giving a presentation in the middle of the night, which is lovely. Thanks for having me. So Peter and I are going to tag team a bit today, so bear with us. I also have a tendency to talk very fast, so apologies to the translators in advance. And also to go over time, so I will try and keep to the strict timing. Okay, apologies, my notes are on one computer and the presentation's on the other. We'll see how we go. So the current paper we're presenting today is presenting some work that Peter and I have been doing together with a couple of colleagues, Val and Meagan in Melbourne, analysing the ways in which sex and gender are presented in the context of labour and regional development in the Gippsland region of Southeast Australia, which if you've ever met Peter before, I'm sure you've heard about. So this flows on from some ideas that Peter presented at the SASI conference in Kyoto in June. So for those of you who were there, this might be a familiar journey with you, and we hope that you kind of come along in this next phase. And for those of you who weren't there, we hope it still makes sense. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Peter to chat a bit about where we left off in SASI.
The background to the project came out of an engagement with regional studies and the ways in which we were attempting to understand the profiles of work and employment in the context of policy development in terms of social and economic change. So our starting point, and what we want to try and illustrate in our presentation here, was in one discipline and one set of questions. And then once we'd done that, Kate in particular took the lead in re-examining and relocating what we found in relation to one area of study and activity. So it throws up really interesting questions. And what we wanted to do was to ask the question, what are the gender assumptions that the formulators and analysts of social and economic change in developing the policies for regional change and regional development, particularly in those areas that are undergoing social and economic decline. What sorts of assumptions do they make about gender, and in what ways do they bring those assumptions into play when analysing the data and then when presenting the policies and the practices that actually follow on from that?
All right, so I don't want to dwell on the literature too much because I want to have time for the juicy stuff, but I'll just kind of give a brief overview of where we're placing this research at the moment. So we've kind of located it within gendered analyses of regional development, which is an interesting sphere of research coming from an Australian perspective because it's incredibly European dominated, and particularly from Scandinavian countries. And so this is really shaped by the geographical and particularly the political contours of that reality, which is far removed from what we're dealing with in Australia. So for example, the studies we're drawing on are mainly working in an EU context and therefore under a framework of gender mainstreaming as the norm. So there's a pre-existing discussion that these regional planners and academics are engaging with around the need to integrate questions of gender into their regional planning. And there are kind of quite open, ongoing discussions around what that means, whether gender mainstreaming is a helpful framework anyway, and what we should really be doing to create more gender-just regional development. In Australia, we don't have that framework at all. Our context is very different, and there's absolutely no requirement to speak to or to acknowledge gendered patterns in the labour market or in regional development at all. And so that really colours the kinds of data we're looking at here. So within this existing research, the kind of central arguments of the literature is that the economy is often assumed to be gender neutral. It takes a masculine norm. Thank you. but that prosperity and gender equality are not necessarily linked. So this is Perrins and Dunford, who work in the UK context, and they talk about the fact that it's dangerous to assume that what is good for the economy and society is automatically equally good for men and women. So this kind of chimes with what was spoken about in the opening plenary about how GDP maybe isn't the best indicator of well-being and development. And so the central argument is, 5 minutes, golly, we better kick on. So basically that a failure to account for gender might actually reaffirm patriarchal structures, and we need to have a more gender-aware regional development context.
Okay, just to very quickly locate it, this is a particular subnational region. It's within the state of Victoria, which is one of the provinces or states in Australia. It's a region in transition. It's gone through enormous industrial disruption over the last 20 years. It's an energy-based, mining-based region on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a major food production area. There has, in fact, over the last 20 years, been a breakdown of traditional industry. It's very specific to the area. It's an area in which there have been numerous reports developed to try and explain the transition, to try and explain the problem. What we did is we picked the 3 core policy documents in the last 3 to 4 years that cover the entire region to say what is the problem in the region, how is it changing, what should we be looking at, what is the transition policy? And in that we asked, where does the question of gender fit?
In the interest of time, we might skip a bit over the methods, but feel free to ask questions later on. So basically we found that there were kind of 3 central observations that emerged, and again I'm going to skim through these a bit, so apologies, but we can discuss further. So basically we found there was an absence of sex and gender as issues to be raised, and especially the absence of gender as an analytical tool to understand the economy. We also found that the sex segregation of the labour market, which is quite high in this area, was barely acknowledged, and that there was a privileging of masculine industries and labour. So firstly, on the absence of sex and gender, and I'll try and whip through this quite quickly, basically there was a profound absence of any kind of meaningful discussion of sex or gender across these 3 planning documents that we looked at. None of these documents recognised gender as a key principle which structures the labour market in the region. There was no understanding of gender as a relation of power, and no use of gender as an analytical tool to understand the kind of landscape of the labour market. I was going to go through each plan separately because there are kind of nuanced differences between them, but we might push on. The second key theme we looked at was the question of sex segregation. So in Gippsland, there are very high levels of labour market sex segregation, and accompanying this, there are quite high levels of income disparity between men and women compared to other Australian regions, and this is particularly pronounced among families with small children. So that kind of speaks to also those links, those kind of inequality flows between households and the workforce, which I'm particularly interested in as well. So despite these high levels of sex segregation, this information barely appears in these reports at all, and where it does, it's kind of presented really cursorily, really quickly, and presented as a fact and not as something to be questioned or changed or discussed at all. Lastly, the third theme we looked at was the idea of the valorisation of masculine labour. So within these documents, there's a really stark divide between the way different sectors are presented, and sectors that have historically been associated with men and masculinity and tend to have high levels of male labour force are presented in quite glowing terms, and those sectors which are feminised, both in kind of character and workforce, are spoken of quite differently. And just a quick example of that, in the Gippsland Regional Plan, which is one of these planning documents, in the kind of executive summary that sits at the front of this report, which is kind of trying to encapsulate, all the important parts of this report, under economic prosperity, all of the sectors that are mentioned are these masculinized sectors, so things like energy and mining, construction, etc. And education, healthcare and education, which are 2 highly feminized sectors, aren't even mentioned under economic prosperity, despite the fact that they're hugely significant employers in the region and have very significant infrastructure associated with them as well, and are quite central to economic planning, one would think. But these are put under the heading Education and Community Wellbeing. And that to me is not only interesting in terms of that kind of privileging of masculine labour, but the ways in which women's work is kind of subsumed under this idea of community and well-being. And that kind of speaks to a lot of feminist theory that talks about feminized women's work, reproductive women's work. So the idea that things like caring for people, even when waged, maybe aren't really actually work at all. And I think that also buys into these ideas that women's work is not only outside of the market a lot of the time, but therefore it's kind of infinite in a way. It doesn't start at 9 a.m. and finish at 5 p.m. It's ongoing, and therefore it's kind of not only misunderstood within market economies a lot, but it also means that women don't get to switch off in the same way potentially. So I thought that was a really interesting way that those gendered narratives were kind of encapsulated within these reports. So I think we're probably out of time nearly? No? Okay, so Peter will just kind of pop in again and relate it back to what we were talking about in June.
Okay, well, in June, where we reached in terms of the analysis starting from regional studies and looking at the construction and formulation of these proposals, is that effectively what happens is that the reports underwrite the status quo, which are then affirmed in practice when the state begins to implement and push forward various transition policies and practices. So basically what we have is the assumptions that are actually made are assumptions about the status quo and how the status quo can then be affirmed by the state and by the major political elites within the region.
So to kind of wind up quite quickly, what I didn't touch on in the methods was that we used the what's the problem represented to be policy analysis approach, which many of you might be familiar with from Carol Bacci. And so we kind of tried to come back to that in this concluding slide and talk about how are these problems represented, and particularly we were interested in what the kinds of absences and silences were. So what was missing from these representations of the problem? So basically the problem in these planning documents is represented as the need to attract capital and the need to shore up existing strengths in masculinized industries. And the absences and silences really centered around this absence of gender as an analytical tool, an absence of how men and women are differently placed within the market, within the economy, and also within households and communities. And absent also was ways to capitalise on some of the feminised industries that are actually quite significant employers in these areas, and the ways in which they might be kind of utilised more productively. These were kind of not seen to be worthy of analysis in the same way that masculine industries were. So we might wind up there to stay on schedule. Thank you very much.